My brother-in-law looked across the Thanksgiving table, smiled at my husband, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't worry, Colin, the maid will get nothing." He meant me. I had been sitting at that table for 12 years. I had been handed the dish towel at every single dinner, every single holiday, as though the gesture were a courtesy rather than a verdict. And I let him say it, because I already knew something he did not. The building 3 blocks from where we were sitting, the one that put $22,000 into my account every single month, had my name on the deed. Only my name. It had been that way since 2016. So I picked up my fork, set it down once, and waited. The wait, as it turned out, was not particularly long. By the time the divorce hearing ended, Rowan Caldwell sat down so hard his chair scraped the marble floor, and the sound carried across the room. The total came to $4.1 million, and not $1 of it was negotiable. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. And one more thing before we start. Have you ever been seated at the wrong table? Drop your city and your answer in the comments. I read every single one. People always say that dignity is something you defend. I used to believe that too, that the right response to being dismissed was a sharp word, a lifted chin, a scene that made everyone look. But I learned something different across 12 years of sitting at the far end of a table, adjacent to the kitchen, within reach of the dish towel. Silence, when it is chosen and not forced on you, is not the same thing as surrender. It looks identical from the outside. That is precisely the point. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is also the most certain. And certainty, dear listeners, does not require an audience. I was certain for years before anyone in that family thought to be worried. My grandmother, Edith Ashworth, grew up in a small house in northeast Portland when the Pearl District was still a working waterfront and the warehouses smelled of sawdust and diesel. She became an accountant in the years before accounting software existed, which meant she understood numbers the way a carpenter understands wood, by feel and by proportion, by the weight of them in her hands. She kept a craft envelope for every document that mattered. Not a file drawer, not a binder, a craft envelope, the stiff brown kind with the metal clasp, labeled in her type block handwriting. Property tax receipts, insurance renewals, the original deed to a 4-story warehouse in Portland's Pearl District that she purchased in 1987 for $210,000, which was every dollar she had saved in 30 years. I grew up watching her label those envelopes. I grew up understanding that the most important documents in a woman's life are the ones no one else knows exist. By the time I turned 24, I was a paralegal at a mid-size estate planning firm in Portland. By the time I turned 31 and married Colin Caldwell, I had 17 years of that work behind me. I understood trust instruments and beneficiary designations and asset titling the way a cardiologist understands the chambers of a heart, not as abstractions, but as architectures, as decisions that determine what survives and what does not. The Caldwells never knew that. They never thought to ask. Colin had introduced me at the first family dinner as Vera, she works at a law office, with a slight downward inflection that meant he considered the detail unimportant. His mother, Marion, had smiled, a practiced, correct smile, and handed me a dish towel before I had finished removing my coat. I was standing in the front hall of their colonial home in Lake Oswego, still dressed for the November cold, and Marion Caldwell was holding out a dish towel with the manner of a woman conferring a role. I took it. I hung up my coat. I went to the kitchen and dried the things that needed drying. That was the first Thanksgiving. By the 12th, I had stopped expecting anything different. The Caldwell house in Lake Oswego was the kind of large, comfortable colonial that announces its owner's opinion of themselves before you have crossed the threshold. The dining room held a table long enough to seat 14, set formally at every holiday with the good china and the tall candles and the centerpiece Marion spent 2 days arranging. There was a logic to the seating that I recognized immediately and never commented on. The important Caldwells, Rowan and his wife Paula, Colin's university friends, the business associates who were occasionally invited, sat at the center of the table, near the candles, in the warm radius of the conversation. Marion sat at the head. Colin sat near his mother. I sat at the far end, close to the kitchen door, beside the children's high chairs and the booster seats, and the small cousins who knocked over their juice. It was close enough to the kitchen that Marion could pass dishes to me without leaving her seat. It was far enough from the center that I could be addressed with a question and then have the conversation move on before I had finished answering. I noticed this the first year. I cataloged it quietly and said nothing. Rowan Caldwell was 49 years old and ran a mid-size construction firm and had the vocal certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in a room where it counted. He was broad-shouldered and laughed at his own jokes half a breath before anyone else could. He called me the maid the first Thanksgiving I attended, not to my face, but across the table to Colin, in that carrying low-voiced men use when they want everyone to hear without appearing to address the room. Colin laughed once, quickly, and looked away. I passed the squash. Over the years, the name became part of the ambient furniture of those gatherings, offered up in the same casual tone one might use to ask about the weather. When did the maid start? Did the maid make the pie? The maid's quiet today, isn't she? I absorbed all of it the way a building absorbs weather. Nothing structural shifts. The walls simply learn the direction of the wind. The dish towel itself was a specific object. Never the same towel twice. Marion Caldwell was not a careless woman, but always the same signal. It arrived in her hand at some point in every gathering, extended toward me with a small efficient nod, and I received it with the same small efficient nod and went where it directed me. Over 12 years, I dried dishes, carried serving bowls, refilled water glasses, and shuttled casserole dishes between the kitchen and the long table, without once being asked how I felt about any of it. The towel was not cruelty in the theatrical sense. That would have required Marion to think of me as a person capable of being wronged. It was something more efficient than cruelty. It was assumption. She assumed I was there to be useful. She had never revised the assumption in 12 years because nothing I had done had given her reason to, because I had never given her reason. That, too, was a choice. I am 41 years old. I am 5 feet 4 inches tall, and I cut my dark hair to my shoulders because longer hair catches on things. I wear oatmeal-colored cardigans to family dinners because they wash easily and draw no comment. I say less than I think in rooms where saying more would accomplish nothing. At work, I move differently, exactly, unhurriedly, with the assurance of someone who has read the statute and knows where the paragraph ends. At the Caldwell table, I moved the way the dish towel moved, where needed. When directed, without friction. None of them understood that those were two different people. None of them understood that I had chosen to show them only one. Have you ever known someone who kept the most important fact in the room to themselves? Not out of shame or secrecy, but out of patience? Have you ever held something so carefully that no one thought to look for it? That is what I want to tell you about. Not the drama of it, because there was very little drama in the end, but the arithmetic of it. The long, clean, irrefutable arithmetic. My grandmother placed her Pearl District warehouse into a revocable trust in 2009. I know the exact date because I was at the firm when the paperwork crossed Sandra Obi's desk, back when Sandra was a senior associate and I was a third-year paralegal, and the Pearl District was still in the early years of what the city planners were calling a transformation. The building was a 4-story converted warehouse with large industrial windows on every floor and a brick courtyard in the center that caught afternoon light in a way that stopped pedestrians on the sidewalk. My grandmother had purchased it in 1987 at a price that everyone around her had considered, privately, to be a mistake. By 2009, it was worth roughly $800,000. By the time she died in 2016, the appraisal had climbed past $2 million. She left it to me alone, as the sole beneficiary of the trust, with the same directness she brought to every document she had ever signed. When the trust became irrevocable upon her death in March of 2016, the property transferred to me and was recorded in Multnomah County, under my name alone. Sandra handled the final distribution paperwork herself. I watched her sign it in her office, in the warm lamplight with the trust binders stacked beside her, and the smell of printer toner steady in the air. She looked up when she finished and said, "You understand this is entirely separate property." I told her I understood. I had understood since the first day I walked into an estate planning office and read the Oregon statute. Separate property inheritance, never commingled with marital funds, never titled jointly, never appearing on a joint tax return. Under Oregon law, it does not touch the marital estate. It is as clean and complete an asset protection as exists in domestic property law. My grandmother had not planned it with the divorce in mind. She could not have known. But she had planned it with the same instinct she brought to every craft envelope she ever labeled. She had made it so that what was mine would remain mine, regardless of what came after. I found a property management company the month the trust distributed and signed a lease with the building's existing commercial tenant before the year was out. The rent was $18,500 a month at that point, deposited directly into a separate account in my name that Colin did not know existed. Over the years, the lease renewed and the rent climbed. And by the time the divorce papers arrived, the monthly deposit had reached $22,000. The account balance on that Saturday morning in October was $211,000. I had been walking past the building on my lunch breaks for 8 years by then, watching the courtyard fill with leaves in the fall, watching the light change on the industrial glass. I had never taken Colin there. I had never pointed it out. I had never once mentioned it at a family dinner, not even when Rowan held forth on Portland real estate values, and the Pearl District specifically, which he did at least twice that I recall, with the authority of a man whose construction firm had bid on projects in that neighborhood. He had no way of knowing that I had listened to him assess the market value of a building I owned. He had no reason to think it was anything other than a coincidence of geography. The first sign that the marriage was ending came 6 months before the papers arrived. Colin began taking his phone to the back porch for calls he described as just work. I am a paralegal who has spent 17 years in a legal office. I know what work calls look like. They last 12 minutes. They end with a sigh and a note on a legal pad. Colin's calls lasted 40 minutes and ended with a lowered voice and a long pause before he came back inside. I noticed the first time. I noted the third time. I said nothing, because saying something would not have changed the arithmetic. It would only have moved the timeline. The second sign was documentary rather than observed. In March of the year before the divorce, Colin added a woman named Deanna Foster as a beneficiary to a life insurance policy he had opened in his own name, without mentioning it to me. I found out because our firm handled a nearly identical beneficiary amendment for a client that same week, and the paperwork crossed my desk on a Thursday afternoon. It was the kind of amendment that requires a notary and a specific form, and the form had a standard structure I could have reproduced from memory. That evening, from habit more than suspicion, I pulled up our household insurance files. The amendment was dated the 14th of March. The notary stamp was from a Ups store on Burnside. I made a copy and placed it in a craft envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk at home. I labeled the envelope in my grandmother's block handwriting. I did not open it again for 7 months. Have you ever picked something up and known, without quite admitting it to yourself, that you would need it later? Have you ever had the discipline to wait? That is what those months were. Not denial. Preparation. The papers arrived on a Saturday morning in October. The weather had turned, and the November rain was already moving in from the coast, the kind of wet gray light that settles over Portland like a held breath. Colin set the papers on the breakfast table next to my coffee cup, not handed them to me, set them down as though he were leaving a receipt, and said, "I think we both know this is right," and left the room before I could respond. I read the cover page. It described the marital estate as modest. I turned to the asset schedule. It listed the joint savings account, which held $34,000. The shared vehicle, a 4-year-old Subaru worth $11,000. The marital home in Northeast Portland, which carried $180,000 in equity. That was the entire accounting, as far as Colin was concerned. That was my 12 years. I sat with the papers for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, the first real rain of the season moved through the yard, and the oak tree at the back property line, the one Colin's father had planted the year Colin was born, and which Colin had pointed out to me once with a son's quiet pride, moved in the wind the way large old things move, with weight and without hurry. I read the asset schedule a second time, and then a third, not because I expected to find anything different, but because I wanted to understand exactly what Colin thought he knew about me. What the asset schedule told me was this: he had never looked. He had lived with me for 12 years, and he had never once thought to ask what a woman who had spent her career in estate planning might know about her own assets. He had accepted the version of me that the Caldwell table had produced, the quiet woman in the oatmeal cardigan who dried the dishes and sat near the kitchen and said less than she thought. That version was not untrue. It was simply incomplete. Rowan called that afternoon. He called at 3 o'clock from a number I recognized, and when I answered, his voice had the particular quality it always had when he believed he was being generous, a warmth that was actually instruction. He told me I should save myself the legal fees. He said, "For old time's sake, Vera, don't make this harder than it has to be." He told me Colin had been more than fair. He told me that I had never really contributed, that phrase exactly, never contributed, and that drawing out the process would only embarrass everyone involved, including me. I listened to all of it. I told him I appreciated the advice. My voice was level throughout, because it was. The calm I felt was not performance. It was the same thing I had felt every time Marion handed me the dish towel, the specific steadiness of a person who knows exactly where they stand and does not need the room to confirm it. I thanked Rowan and hung up, and then I called Sandra Obi. Sandra was in her office. She was always in her office on Saturday afternoons in October, because October was when the year-end estate reviews came in, and she processed them in the quiet of the weekend. When I told her Colin had filed, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bring me the envelope." She meant the craft envelope. She had known about the trust since 2016. She had signed the final distribution paperwork. She had watched the building go from a grandmother's 40-year project to a fully distributed separate property asset in my name, and she had said, back then, that the documentation was as clean as she had ever seen. Now she was telling me to bring it in. I told her I would be there Monday morning. She said, "Vera, bring the whole drawer. I want to tell you what it felt like, that Saturday afternoon, to sit in a house where the coffee had gone cold and the asset schedule had been written by someone who had never thought to look, and to know exactly what Sandra Obi's office contained. It felt like standing in a room where everyone else is reading from a map that ends before the territory does. It felt like holding a door key to a building that nobody else knows exists. It did not feel like victory. Not yet. Justice, I have learned, does not feel like victory until it is complete. Until then, it feels like arithmetic. The low point was not the papers and not Rowan's call. The low point was Sunday morning, the day between. I drove to the Pearl District that morning, not to the building, not exactly, but through the neighborhood, along the streets where the converted warehouses had become galleries and restaurants and architecture firms, where the November light came low and gray off the Willamette and caught the industrial glass of the upper floors. I parked half a block from the building and sat in the car. I had owned that building for 8 years. I had walked past it on my lunch breaks, watched the tenants move through the courtyard, noted the oak tree and the brick interior that had been there since my grandmother bought the property in 1987. I had never felt possessive of it the way some people feel possessive of things they have bought. It had come to me the way significant things sometimes come, not through effort but through inheritance, through a woman who labeled her envelopes and believed in the architecture of preparation. The marital home had $180,000 in equity. The joint account held $34,000. The vehicle was worth $11,000. By Colin's accounting, my 12 years of marriage had a total value of roughly $112. $500 after the split, less than 6 months of rental income from the building 30 feet from where I was parked. The cost of the Caldwell Thanksgivings was not in what they had taken from me. It was in what they had never thought to acknowledge. 12 years of dinners. 12 years of dish towels and children's table seating and conversations that moved on before I had finished answering. The cost of that kind of invisibility is not money. But in this case, the money was a precise measure of exactly how wrong they had been about what they were dealing with. Have you ever had a moment when the full shape of something became clear to you all at once? Not a revelation, nothing so dramatic. Just the sudden legibility of a pattern you had been watching assemble itself for years? That is what the Sunday morning drive was. I drove home. I set out the craft envelope and the file of deposit records and the copy of the beneficiary amendment from the bottom drawer. I stacked them on the kitchen table. Then I went to bed. Monday morning, I was in Sandra's office by 8. The office was as I had known it for 17 years. Warm lamp light, the particular smell of printer toner and old paper, trust binders stacked along the west wall in a system that looked like disorder and was actually a precise taxonomy. Sandra reviewed the asset schedule Colin's attorney had filed. She read it once, set it on her desk, and said a single word: incomplete. She pulled the trust certificate from the craft envelope, unfolded the recorded deed, and laid the 8 years of separate deposit records across her desk blotter in chronological order. She looked at me over the top of the papers and said, "Do you want them to find out before the hearing or at the hearing?" I said, "The hearing." She nodded once. She had been a senior partner for 6 years by that point, and had the quality of very experienced attorneys in private practice, a stillness that is not detachment, but the opposite of it, a complete and unhurried attention that makes everyone else in the room feel slightly more located. She placed the papers back in their order and said, "I'll prepare the production." 3 weeks later, Colin's attorney filed a formal discovery request seeking a complete accounting of all assets held by either party, individually or jointly, during the marriage and at the time of filing. It was a standard request. I imagine they expected it to return a modest list, the joint account, the vehicle, perhaps a small retirement account. Sandra responded with a 40-page production. It included the full appraisal of the Pearl District property, current value $3,960,000 at that point. This was before the updated appraisal came back, along with a complete title history going back to my grandmother's original purchase in 1987, a certified copy of the trust instrument showing the date of execution, the death certificate from 2016, the distribution records, and 8 years of monthly deposit statements showing the rental income flowing into a separate account that had never, in any month, received a single deposit from a joint source. The separation of the funds was absolute and documented to the penny. The record was cleaner than most trusts Sandra had ever handled. She told me so, with the particular dry precision she reserved for things she actually admired. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the discovery production was delivered to opposing counsel. It was Colin. He was calling from his cell, not through his attorney, which told me the conversation was not on the record. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before: careful. The way a person is careful when they have stepped onto ice and cannot immediately locate the shore. He asked me, very quietly, if we could work something out before the process went any further. I let a moment pass before I answered. Not for effect. I simply needed a moment to locate the right words. Then I told him I was comfortable with how far things had already gone. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Vera, I didn't know." I told him I understood that. I told him I had always known that he didn't know. The conversation ended shortly afterward. His attorney filed a motion to compel additional discovery the following week. The motion was the kind of motion that gets filed when an attorney knows the facts are not in their favor, but needs to demonstrate effort. It argued that the Pearl District property should be reclassified as a marital asset, because I had, according to the motion's language, benefited from the stability of the marital household during the appreciation period, and that therefore a portion of the appreciation should be considered marital gain. It was a creative argument. I had seen versions of it before, in other cases, in other contexts. I knew exactly how the statute addressed it, and so did Sandra. She responded with a 12-page brief that cited Oregon's separate property law in full, documented the consistent maintenance of separate accounts across the 8-year period, and noted that the property had been recorded under my name alone 11 months before my grandmother's death, and 3 years before any appreciation became material. The brief was precise and, I thought, somewhat devastating in its quietness. The motion was denied in 11 days. Rowan called once during this period. He called from his personal number on a Tuesday evening in November. I watched the phone ring on my kitchen counter until it stopped. I did not listen to the voicemail until the following week. When I did, I heard his voice in a register I had not heard from him before, lower, the bravado replaced by something that was trying to sound like concern, but was actually, I thought, the sound of a man who has begun to understand the geometry of a room he had assumed he controlled. He said he thought there might be a way to handle things that was better for everyone. He said he hoped I wasn't making decisions out of, and here there was a pause, emotion. I deleted the message. I did not return the call. There was a point in December, about 2 weeks before the appraisal came back, when Colin's attorney requested an informal settlement conference. Sandra told me about it on a Wednesday morning with the careful neutrality she used when she had an opinion she was not yet sharing. I asked her what she thought. She said, "I think they are beginning to understand the geometry of the situation." We attended the conference on a Thursday afternoon in a neutral conference room at a title company 2 blocks from the courthouse. Beige walls. A round table, a carafe of water nobody touched. Colin's attorney opened with the argument that, given the length of the marriage and my role in the marital household, a court might be persuaded to consider a portion of the building's appreciation as a joint contribution. Sandra let him finish. Then she opened her folder, slid across the table a single page. A printout of the Oregon statute on separate property inheritance, with the relevant subsection highlighted in yellow, and said, "The marital household's duration is not a factor under the statute when the asset was inherited, separately titled, and never commingled. The record here meets all 3 prongs." Colin's attorney looked at the page. He looked at Sandra. He said he would need to review the case law. Sandra said, "I've included the case citations on the reverse." He turned the page over. A long silence followed. Colin had not spoken once. He was looking at the carafe of water with the expression of a man who would very much like the meeting to end. It ended 12 minutes later, with no agreement reached, and no further conference scheduled. We walked out into the December cold, and Sandra said, simply, "They'll try one more thing." She was right. What they tried was a deposition. Colin's attorney noticed my deposition for the 2nd week of January, asking for a complete accounting of all assets, communications with Sandra Obi, and any documentation related to the trust or the property held prior to the marriage. The deposition took place on a Tuesday morning in Sandra's office. She had insisted on our location. And opposing counsel had agreed without much resistance, which told me something about their confidence level. Colin's attorney arrived with a second associate and a court reporter, and the particular focused energy of a person who believes they have found a thread to pull. He asked about my grandmother. He asked about the trust. He asked when I had first known about the property's value. He asked whether Colin had ever been present at the building. He asked whether I had ever deposited any rental income into a joint account, in any amount, at any point. The answers were 2009 at the time of distribution, never, and no. Every answer had a document behind it. Sandra sat beside me and said nothing for 93 minutes because there was nothing for her to say. The record spoke entirely for itself. At the end of the deposition, Colin's attorney gathered his papers and thanked me for my time in the tone of a man who has pulled a thread and found it went nowhere. I thanked him in return. I was calm throughout, because the calm was real. You cannot be unsettled by questions whose answers you have held for 8 years. The building had been reassessed by an independent commercial real estate appraiser Sandra had engaged, and the revised figure came back at $4.1 million, $140,000 above the number we had used in the initial discovery production, which had itself been based on a county assessment from 18 months prior. Sandra sent a short letter to opposing counsel with a revised total underlined, and a note indicating that the plaintiff's asset schedule had been updated accordingly. I imagine that letter arrived in Colin's attorney's office on a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, and I imagine that it was forwarded to Colin with the kind of subject line that makes a person close their laptop and look out the window for a while. I was at work when Sandra sent it. I was in my own office with the blinds open to the gray December light. And the first of the month deposit notification had arrived on my phone 2 weeks earlier, $22,000, as always, as it had always been, as it would continue to be regardless of what happened in that courtroom. I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to the trust instrument I was reviewing for a client. I want you to understand something about the months between the papers arriving and the hearing. They were not triumphant months. They were procedural months. There is a particular quality to procedural time, the time of filings and responses and countermotions and revised appraisals, that strips away almost everything except the fact. You cannot be dramatic in procedural time. You can only be accurate. I had been trained to be accurate. I had been trained in it for 17 years by the work, and before the work by my grandmother, who believed that precision was a form of respect for the document, for the law, for the person you were trying to protect. In those months, I felt her presence in the most concrete way possible, in the craft envelope in Sandra's file, in the clean record of deposits, in the recorded deed with my name printed in the county's block type. She had done the work 37 years before it was needed. That is the long game. That is the only game that matters. There was an afternoon in January, 6 weeks before the hearing, when Sandra called me into her office and asked me to sit down. She had the full production laid out on the conference table, the deed, the trust instrument, the appraisals, the deposit records, the title history, and she walked me through it one more time. Not because she thought I had forgotten anything, but because she wanted to be certain I understood the totality of what we were presenting. She said, "Vera, when they see this in court, there's going to be a moment." I asked her what kind of moment. She said the kind where everyone in the room recalibrates. She paused, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Your grandmother built something in 1987 that protected you in 2024. Not by accident, by design." I looked at the deed on the table for a long time after that. The original purchase date was printed in the county's standard type, October 14th, 1987. My grandmother had been 34 years old. I was now 41. She had started earlier than I had. She had known things I was only beginning to understand. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February, and the morning of it was the particular February gray that Portland does better than almost any other city I know. The sky the color of old silver, the rain not quite rain, the streetcar running 2 blocks from the Pearl District building with the same indifferent regularity it always had. I dressed in a charcoal blazer and the small earrings my grandmother had left me along with the trust, plain gold, oval, the kind that need no occasion. I made coffee and drank it at the kitchen counter and did not look at my phone. The $22,000 deposit was not due for another week. I knew that. But I had looked at the deposit notification so many times in the preceding months that the rhythm of it had become a kind of anchor, a once-a-month confirmation that the structure my grandmother had built was still standing, still generating, still entirely mine. Sandra met me outside the courthouse at 8:30. She was carrying the craft envelope in 2 folders, and she had the quiet authority of someone who has been in that building many times and knows exactly how its machinery moves. She said, "Ready?" I told her I had been ready for 8 years. She smiled once, the particular smile of a senior partner who has seen a great deal and is about to see something she will find satisfying, and we went inside. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. I had worked in law for 17 years and had never had occasion to sit at the plaintiff's table myself, and the room had a quality I had not anticipated. The acoustic intimacy of it, the way sound traveled in the wood-paneled space, the way the judge's bench was not elevated dramatically but only enough. Colin was already seated at the respondent's table when we entered. He was wearing a gray suit, and his face had the careful neutrality of a man who has been coached on expression. His attorney sat beside him, legal pad open. Rowan was in the gallery. He had not been invited. I had known he would come. I did not look at Rowan when I entered. I sat down at the plaintiff's table and looked at the craft envelope in Sandra's hands. And I thought about my grandmother sitting at an accountant's desk in 1987, writing a check for $210,000, believing in a building that everyone around her thought was too much money for too uncertain a return. She had been right, in the end. She had simply been right before the evidence was available to confirm it. That is the nature of patience. You are right before anyone can see it. And you wait for the moment when the record catches up to what you already knew. The hearing opened in the standard way. The judge reviewed the filings, confirmed the parties and their counsel, and asked Colin's attorney to state his position on the asset schedule. The attorney said the marital estate was as described: modest joint holdings, shared equity in the marital home. He mentioned that additional discovery had been conducted. He did not mention what it had found, because what it had found was not going to serve him. The judge asked if the plaintiff had additions to the asset schedule. Sandra said yes. She stood, placed the craft envelope on the plaintiff's table, and removed the trust certificate. She laid it flat. She laid the recorded deed beside it. She laid the appraisal and the deposit records beside those. She did not speak immediately. She allowed the judge to see the stack of documents before she began. She confirmed the admissibility of each instrument in turn. The trust certificate, admitted. The recorded deed, admitted. The appraisal at $4.1 million, admitted. The 8-year deposit record showing $22,000 monthly into a separate account, admitted. Colin's attorney asked for a continuance. The judge denied it without notable pause. Then she asked Sandra to proceed. Sandra walked through the asset schedule line by line. She stated the trust's date of execution, 2009. She stated the date of distribution, March 2016, 11 months after my grandmother's death. She stated the recorded title, My Name Alone, filed in Multnomah County, no other party named, no joint interest created at any point in its 8-year history as a distributed asset. She stated the rental income, $22,000 per month, for a total of $2,376,000 in the 8 years since distribution, all deposited into a separate account with no commingling of any marital funds at any point. She stated the appraised value, $4.1 million, as of the updated assessment in December. She stated the account balance, $211,000 on the date of filing. She stated the Oregon statute. She stated the recorded history back to 1987. She set down her notes and looked at the judge. The judge looked at Colin's attorney. The attorney looked at Colin. And Colin looked at the table. He looked at the table the way a person looks at something they cannot make sense of, but cannot look away from, either. He read the appraisal figure on the page in front of him. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. Then he set it down, and he did not pick it up. His hands were flat on the table, and he was very still. He did not look up for a long time. When he finally did, he looked at Sandra, and then he looked at me, and his expression had the quality of someone who has understood something too late. Not just the fact of the building or the number or the 8 years of deposits, but the larger thing those facts named. He had lived with me for 12 years, and he had never thought to look. He had assumed the version of me the table had made. He had never asked. Rowan, in the gallery behind us, made a sound I cannot precisely describe. Not a word, not quite. He sat down suddenly in the gallery chair, the way a person sits when their legs have made a decision before their mind has caught up. The chair scraped the marble floor, and the sound carried through the room with the sharp finality of a period at the end of a sentence. I heard it. I kept my hands folded on the plaintiff's table. I looked at the judge. I did not turn around. I did not smile. The dish towel I had accepted for 12 years, the signal, the verdict, the small ceremony of erasure, was at the bottom of a donation box I had dropped off the week before. I had not replaced it with anything, because I did not need a towel. I had a building. The judge ruled that afternoon. The Pearl District property remained entirely within my separate estate, $4.1 million, untouched by the marital proceedings, returning to me as what it had always been, mine alone, as it had been since March of 2016. The separate rental account, with its balance of $211,000, remained mine. I received my full share of the marital home equity, $90,000. Colin received the marital home, the vehicle, and the joint savings account. His attorney filed no appeal. There was nothing to appeal. The record was what it was. It had been what it was for 8 years. The architecture of it was simply visible now, in the way that a structure is visible once someone has thought to shine a light on it. Nothing had changed. Everything had become clear. Sandra and I walked out of the courthouse just after 4 p.m. The February rain had moved in fully by then, the way Portland rain comes in February, not dramatic, but total, the streets reflecting the streetcar lights in long, wavering lines. We stood under the awning for a moment. Sandra said, "Your grandmother would have appreciated the efficiency." I thought that was exactly right. Edith Ashworth had not been a sentimental woman. She had been a precise one. She would have appreciated the efficiency. She would have appreciated the recorded deed, the clean separation of accounts, the 12-page brief, the 11-day denial. She would have labeled the result in her block handwriting and put it in a craft envelope and moved on. I kept the Pearl District building. Of course I kept it. I kept the separate rental account. I signed the deed transfer on the marital home on a Thursday afternoon, in a room that smelled of old carpet and copy toner, the same combination of smells I had known for 17 years. And I handed the pen back to the notary and walked out into the February cold and felt nothing dramatic, only the specific calm of a completed transaction. The $22,000 arrived on the 1st of March, as it always had. I noted it and went back to the brief I was reviewing for a client. The building's courtyard has a single oak tree that was already old when my grandmother bought the property in 1987. I had lunch in that courtyard the Friday after the hearing, at one of the small iron tables the tenant had set out under the oak. And the late winter light came through the bare branches in the way it does in February, thin and direct and carrying more warmth than you expect. The tree had been there before my grandmother. It had been there through the 37 years she held the building. It was there now. It would be there long after me. I ate my lunch and looked at it and thought about a specific afternoon when I was 9 years old and my grandmother brought me to this neighborhood. It was not the Pearl District then. Not with that name, not with that meaning. It was simply a block of warehouses near the waterfront where she had a meeting with a property manager. She had held my hand on the sidewalk and pointed up at the building's facade and told me that the most important thing about a building is not what it looks like, but whether the foundation is sound. I had been 9 years old, and I had not understood what she meant. I had understood that she meant it. I had understood that the building was important to her in a way that was larger than the building. Sitting under the oak tree in February 30, 2 years later, I thought, the foundation was sound. She had made certain of it. She had been making certain of it since before I was born. Marion Caldwell sent a card 2 weeks after the hearing. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope. I set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. For several days, I walked past it when I made coffee in the mornings. Then, one morning it was gone. It had fallen behind the refrigerator at some point, or been moved by a draft from the window, or simply slipped the way small things slip when no one is watching them. I did not retrieve it. Whatever Marion Caldwell wanted to say to me, she had had 12 Thanksgivings in which to say it. She had handed me a dish towel instead. Some conversations happened too late to matter, and the words in that envelope, whatever they were, belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. Rowan, I understand, does not speak about the hearing. I have heard this through the kind of peripheral channel that information always finds in small professional worlds. A client who knew a client, a name mentioned at a deposition for a different matter entirely. I do not know what Rowan says privately. To Paula, to Colin, to the construction associates he holds court for, at whatever table he now occupies. I know what he said at Thanksgiving for 12 years. I know that he said it confidently and completely without concern for whether I might have something to say in response. He had made a calculation about what I was worth, and he had never revised it, because it had never occurred to him that his calculation might be incomplete. That is the particular failure of contempt. It prevents the person who holds it from seeing what is directly in front of them. I am still at the law firm. I still work with Sandra. The office still smells of printer toner and old paper, and the trust binders are still organized in a system that looks like disorder and is not. On the Monday after the hearing, a paralegal named Gwen, who had been at the firm for 3 years, stopped by my desk in the morning and set down a cup of coffee. She did not say anything specific about where I had been on Tuesday, because she is too precise for that, but she said, "You look like you slept." I told her I had slept well for the first time in 4 months. She nodded and went back to her desk. That was the conversation. It was enough. The people who work in estate planning understand, better than most, the difference between the resolution of a process and the resolution of a feeling. The process had resolved. The feeling, the specific feeling of having been invisible to someone for 12 years, would take longer. But it was resolving incrementally, the way things resolve when the architecture has held, and the paperwork is complete, and the first of the month deposit has arrived, as it always does, regardless of what else is happening in the world. And I think about the language of them, the precision required, the forward motion built into every clause, the way a well-drafted document can reach forward in time and hold something steady for a person who does not yet know they will need it held. I think about the clients who come in and want to protect what they have, and I think about all the different kinds of inheritance there are. The kind that is counted in dollars, and the kind that is counted in the understanding of what to do with them. My grandmother used to say that a woman's most valuable asset is the one no one thinks to look for. She said it practically, the way she said everything, not as a maxim, but as an instruction. The way she might explain the correct way to close a file or label an envelope. She was right. She was simply right. Colin looked for everything he thought I had and cataloged it in a modest asset schedule, and never once thought to check what Edith Ashworth had left her granddaughter, because no one in that family had ever considered me worth knowing well enough to ask. To Rowan, wherever you are, the maid owns the building. She always did. What would you have done? Would you have told them, or waited for the hearing? Tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who has ever been handed the dish towel, share this story with them. Thank you, as always, for listening.